Sarah Chen had been driving for nearly 12 hours when the first drops of rain began to spatter against her windshield. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dense Colorado mountains, and her fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the familiar burn of exhaustion, and reached for her coffee cup only to find it cold and bitter. The radio had lost signal an hour ago, leaving her with nothing but the rhythmic thrum of tires on wet pavement and the occasional groan of wind through the mountain passes. She'd been making this drive from Denver to her sister's wedding in Portland for what felt like an eternity, and every mile seemed to stretch longer than the last. When the neon sign for Mountain View Motor Lodge flickered into view through the increasingly heavy rain, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The motel sat alone beside the highway, its parking lot nearly empty save for an old pickup truck and a sedan that had seen better days. The building itself was a relic from the 1960s, all wood paneling and stone facade, with room numbers painted in fading yellow on weathered doors. Sarah pulled into the lot and killed the engine, listening to the rain drum against her car's roof. The motel office glowed with warm light, and she could see a figure moving behind the front desk. She grabbed her purse and jacket, then made a dash for the entrance. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, shaking droplets from her hair. The office smelled of old coffee and pine air freshener, and country music played softly from a radio somewhere behind the counter. An elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes looked up from a crossword puzzle, setting down his pencil with a welcoming smile. "Evening, miss. Terrible weather to be traveling in," he said, his voice carrying the gentle cadence of someone who'd lived in these mountains his whole life. A brass nameplate on the desk read, "Frank Morrison, manager." "Tell me about it," Sarah replied, approaching the counter. "I was hoping you might have a room available for the night. Just something clean and quiet." Frank nodded, pulling out an old-fashioned registration book. "You're in luck. We've got plenty of space tonight. Most folks don't venture up this way when the weather turns nasty." He glanced out the rain-streaked window. "Radio says we're in for quite a storm. Good thing you stopped when you did." Sarah filled out the registration form, grateful for the warmth of the office after hours on the cold road. "How far to the next town?" she asked. "About 40 miles through Bear Creek Pass," Frank said, handing her a key attached to a plastic fob shaped like a pine tree. "But that road gets mighty treacherous in weather like this. You made the right call stopping here." He paused, studying her with concern. "You traveling alone?" "Yes, heading to my sister's wedding in Portland. I probably should have flown, but I thought a road trip would be nice." Sarah laughed ruefully. "Should have checked the weather forecast." Frank chuckled. "Mountain weather's got a mind of its own. Room 12 is right around the corner, nice and close to the office if you need anything. There's a vending machine by the ice maker, and the diner down the road closes at 11 if you're hungry." Sarah thanked him and headed back into the rain. Room 12 was exactly what she'd expected, clean but dated, with a double bed covered in a faded floral bedspread, a small table with 2 chairs, and a television that looked like it predated cable. The heater kicked on with a mechanical wheeze as she turned up the thermostat, and she was grateful for the warmth. She called her sister to let her know she'd stopped for the night, then ordered a pizza from the only place that would deliver to the motel. The delivery driver, a college-aged kid in a rain-soaked jacket, seemed surprised to find anyone staying there. "Don't get many guests this time of year," he said, handing over the steaming box, "especially with weather like this. You picked a good night to hole up somewhere safe." After he left, Sarah ate her pizza while watching an old movie on the television, the sound of rain against the window providing a steady backdrop. She tried to shake the odd feeling that had been growing since she'd arrived, a sense that something wasn't quite right, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. It was nearly midnight when she heard the voices. At first she thought it might be other guests in nearby rooms, but as she listened more carefully, she realized the voices were coming from outside. She muted the television and moved to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to peer into the darkness. The rain had intensified, creating sheets of water that made it difficult to see clearly. The parking lot was illuminated by a single flickering streetlight, and beyond that, everything faded into impenetrable darkness. She couldn't see anyone, but the voices continued, low, urgent whispers that seemed to drift on the wind. Sarah let the curtain fall back and tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, or perhaps the sound of rain and wind playing tricks on her tired mind. She'd been driving for hours after all, and exhaustion could make anyone paranoid, but then she heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside her room. Sarah held her breath, every muscle in her body tensing as the footsteps paused directly outside her door. The sound of the rain seemed to fade away, leaving only the thundering of her own heartbeat. A soft knock echoed through the room. Miss Chen?" It was Frank's voice, but something about it sounded different, strained, almost frightened. "I need to speak with you. It's important." Sarah approached the door cautiously, her hand hovering over the deadbolt. "What is it, Frank? Is everything okay?" There was a long pause before he answered. "There's been an incident. I need you to come with me to the office. Please, it's urgent." "What kind of incident?" Sarah asked, but there was no response. She pressed her ear to the door, listening for movement, but heard only the relentless drumming of rain. "Frank?" she called out, but still no answer. Sarah waited several minutes before carefully unlocking the door and opening it a crack. The small covered walkway outside her room was empty, rain cascading from the overhanging roof. She stepped outside, looking left and right, but saw no sign of the motel manager. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air ran down her spine. She was about to retreat back into her room when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There were no footprints in the gravel leading to or from her door. The rain should have left clear impressions, but the ground was undisturbed. Sarah quickly locked herself back in the room, her hands shaking as she drew the curtains tight. She tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe Frank had stood on the concrete walkway. Maybe the rain had washed away his tracks. But deep down, she knew something was very wrong. She decided to call the front desk, but when she picked up the phone, there was no dial tone. The line was completely dead. Panic began to creep into her chest as she grabbed her cell phone, only to discover she had no signal. The screen showed no bars, just an empty network indicator that mocked her growing fear. Sarah paced the small room, her mind racing. She could drive away, leave right now, and push through to the next town despite the weather. But something about that idea filled her with dread. The thought of being alone on that dark mountain road seemed even more terrifying than staying put. She was trying to decide what to do when she heard the voices again, clearer this time. They were coming from the direction of the motel office, and now she could make out individual words. "To found her car, to been waiting, to has to be tonight." Sarah's blood turned to ice. They were talking about her, moving carefully to avoid making noise. She turned off all the lights in her room and crept to the window. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see the motel office. Frank was there, but he wasn't alone. Two other figures stood with him, a tall, thin man in a dark coat and a woman with long hair that hung like a curtain around her face. They were all looking directly at her room. Sarah jerked back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to get out of there, had to get to her car and drive away as fast as possible. But as she grabbed her keys and moved toward the door, she heard footsteps approaching again, multiple sets this time. "Miss Chen," Frank's voice called out, but now it sounded different again, hollow somehow. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." The woman's voice joined his, sweet and sing-song. "There's nothing to be afraid of, dear. We're here to help." Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the door, trying to control her breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside, and she could hear quiet murmuring, words she couldn't quite make out but that sent chills down her spine. Then came a sound that nearly made her scream, the slow, deliberate scraping of metal against metal. Someone was trying to unlock her door. Sarah looked around frantically for another way out. The bathroom had a small window, but it was too high and narrow to climb through. She was trapped. The scraping stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then Frank spoke again, his voice now cold and mechanical. "Sarah Chen, age 28, driving a blue Honda Civic, license plate." He recited her exact license number. "Left Denver at 6 this morning, destination Portland, Oregon. No one expects you for 2 days." How could he know all of that? She hadn't told him any of those details when she checked in. The woman's voice floated through the door like smoke. "We've been waiting for someone like you, Sarah. Someone alone. Someone who wouldn't be missed right away." "Waiting for what?" Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The third voice answered, the tall man she'd seen in the office. His words were barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the room, they might as well have been shouted. "To take your place." Sarah's mind reeled. Take her place? What did that mean? She heard the sound of metal scraping again, more urgently this time. They were definitely trying to get in, and from the sound of it, they were having success. The deadbolt wouldn't hold them for long. Desperate, Sarah grabbed the chair from beside the small table and wedged it under the door handle. It wouldn't stop them, but it might buy her a few precious seconds. Then she moved to the window and carefully peeled back the curtain. The parking lot was still illuminated by the single flickering streetlight, her car sitting just 20 feet away, if she could get to it. But as she watched, another figure emerged from the darkness near her car, a fourth person, this one shorter and stockier than the others. They were surrounding her, cutting off any chance of escape. Sarah sank to the floor, her back against the wall, as the horrible truth began to dawn on her. This wasn't a coincidence. They'd been waiting for her specifically, or at least for someone like her. But how? How could they have known she would stop here? The answer came to her in a flash of terrible understanding. The weather, the storm had been predicted, forcing travelers to seek shelter. And this motel was the only option for miles in either direction. They'd been waiting for someone desperate enough to stop, someone alone and vulnerable. The scraping at the door stopped, and Sarah heard Frank's voice again, but now it sounded different once more, eager, hungry. "We know you can hear us, Sarah. There's no point in hiding. We've done this before, many times. We know exactly how this works." The woman's voice joined in, and Sarah realized with growing horror that it was changing, becoming deeper, more masculine with each word. "The last one fought too. You know, a young man about your age. He was driving through last month when the snow started. Poor thing thought he could trust us." Sarah's blood ran cold. She thought about the college kid who delivered her pizza, how surprised he'd seemed to find anyone staying at the motel. How long had it been since there were any real guests here? The tall man's voice drifted through the door like poison. "We've been Frank for 40 years, Sarah. Before that we were Martha, the previous owner. And before that Thomas, the man who built this place. We learned from each one, become them completely." "What are you?" Sarah whispered, but even as she asked, she knew she didn't want to hear the answer. Frank's voice, or whatever was using Frank's voice, replied with something that might have been laughter. "We are what happens when people disappear and no one looks too hard for answers. We are the shadows between the highway signs, the faces behind friendly smiles. We are the reason why some travelers never reach their destinations." The sound of splintering wood filled the room as something struck the door with tremendous force. The chair Sarah had wedged under the handle groaned but held. Sarah scrambled to her feet, looking around desperately for anything she could use as a weapon. The small television, the lamp beside the bed, even the ice bucket from the bathroom. Nothing seemed adequate against whatever was trying to get in. Another blow struck the door, and this time the frame began to crack. Wood splinters scattered across the floor, and Sarah could see fingers, pale, 2 long fingers, reaching through the gap. "We promise it won't hurt," the woman's voice called out, but now it sounded exactly like Sarah's own voice. "We've gotten very good at making the transition smooth." Sarah grabbed the heavy base of the bedside lamp, ripping the cord from the wall. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As she hefted it in her hands, something caught her eye, a business card that had fallen from Frank's shirt pocket when he'd leaned over the registration desk. She could just make out the text in the dim light filtering through the curtains. It wasn't Frank Morrison's business card. It was for someone named David Webb, and it was over a year old. The door gave way with a thunderous crack, and 3 figures stepped into the room. In the darkness, Sarah could barely make out their shapes, but what she could see made her stomach lurch. They moved wrong, like puppets with tangled strings, and their faces seemed to shift and blur in the shadows. "Hello, Sarah," said the thing wearing Frank's appearance. "Thank you for making this so easy." Sarah raised the lamp, backing toward the far corner of the room. "Stay away from me." The woman thing tilted its head, and Sarah could see that its features were already beginning to change, becoming more familiar. "You're going to like being us, Sarah. We've had so much practice. What happened to the real Frank?" Sarah demanded, though part of her already knew. The tall man stepped forward, and in the dim light, Sarah could see that his face was a horrible patchwork, features that didn't quite belong together, as if assembled from different people. "Frank is still here," it said, tapping its chest, "and so is Martha, and Thomas, and David, and all the others. They're all part of us now. Soon you will be too." Sarah swung the lamp as hard as she could, catching the Frank thing in the side of the head. It stumbled but didn't fall, and when it looked back at her, its face had changed completely. Now it wore the features of a young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "David tried to fight too," it said in David's voice. "Look how well that worked out for him." The woman thing lunged forward, its movements unnaturally quick and fluid. Sarah dodged to the side, but there was nowhere to go in the small room. Hands that felt like ice closed around her wrists, and she found herself staring into eyes that reflected no light at all. "It's better if you don't struggle," the thing said, and now its voice was changing again, cycling through different tones and accents. "The transition is smoother when the subject is calm." Sarah felt a strange coldness creeping up her arms from where the creature touched her. Her vision began to blur, and she could feel memories that weren't her own beginning to surface in her mind. Frank's life, his childhood in these mountains, his love for his late wife, his pride in running the motel, all of it flooding into her consciousness like water through a broken dam.
But there were other memories too. Martha, struggling as the coldness consumed her. Thomas, screaming as his identity was stripped away. David, fighting until the very end. His last coherent thought, a desperate wish that someone would find out what had happened to him. With their memories came their strength, their will to resist. Sarah felt herself surrounded by the ghosts of everyone these creatures had consumed, and she realized they were trying to help her, trying to give her the power to fight back. "No," she whispered, then louder, "No."
Sarah wrenched herself free from the creature's grasp, stumbling backward toward the door. The cold sensation retreated from her arms, but she could still feel the echo of all those stolen lives. The three things that had once been people turned toward her with expressions of mild surprise. They weren't used to resistance at this stage of the process. "That's not possible," the frank thing said. "Once the connection is made, the transfer is inevitable. Tell that to them," Sarah replied, gesturing to the empty air around her. But she could feel them: Frank, Martha, Thomas, David, and all the others. They were still there, trapped but not entirely gone, and they were angry. The creatures seemed to sense something was wrong. They exchanged glances, their faces cycling through different identities, like a broken television switching channels. Sarah backed toward the shattered doorway, keeping the lamp raised. "How many people have you killed? How many lives have you stolen?" The woman thing smiled, and for a moment, its face settled into something almost human. "We don't kill, Sarah. We preserve. Everyone who comes to us lives on as part of something greater." "That's not living," Sarah said. "That's imprisonment." She reached the doorway and bolted into the rain-soaked night. Behind her, she could hear the creatures following, their movements creating an odd shuffling sound on the gravel. Sarah ran toward her car, her feet slipping on the wet pavement. The rain was coming down harder now, and lightning flickered in the distance. She fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get them into the lock. The car door opened just as the creatures reached her. Cold fingers grabbed at her jacket, but she threw herself into the driver's seat and slammed the door. The engine turned over on the second try, and she threw the car into reverse. In the rearview mirror, she could see the three figures standing in the parking lot, no longer bothering to maintain their human facades. They were tall and pale, with too many joints in their arms and legs, and their faces were blank spaces where features should have been. Sarah spun the wheel and gunned the engine, her car fishtailing on the wet asphalt as she fled toward the highway. In her mirror, she watched the motel shrink into the distance, its neon sign flickering once before going dark. She didn't slow down until she reached the next town, nearly an hour later. The first thing she did was call the police, but when she tried to explain what had happened, she realized how insane it sounded. Shape-shifting creatures at a mountain motel, missing persons who'd been absorbed into some kind of collective entity. The officer who took her statement was polite but skeptical. He promised to send someone to check on the Mountain View Motor Lodge, but Sarah could tell he thought she was either lying or having some kind of breakdown. 2 days later, the officer called her back. The motel was abandoned, he said. Looked like it had been empty for months. No sign of Frank Morrison or anyone else. The county records showed the place had been closed since the previous owner died in an accident last winter. But Sarah knew better. She knew they were still there, waiting for the next traveler desperate enough to stop, the next person alone and vulnerable on a dark mountain road. She never found out what happened to the real Frank Morrison, or Martha, or Thomas, or David Webb, whose business card she still carried in her purse. But sometimes, late at night, she thought she could hear their voices carried on the wind, warning other travelers to keep driving, to never stop at the place with the flickering neon sign. And sometimes, when she looked in the mirror, she thought she could see them standing behind her, all the people the creatures had consumed, trapped but not entirely gone, using what little strength they had left to help others avoid their fate. Sarah made it to her sister's wedding, but she never spoke about what had happened that night. Who would believe her? Instead, she started carrying detailed maps on every road trip, making sure she always knew where the next town was, where she could find help if she needed it. Because somewhere in the Colorado mountains, the Mountain View Motor Lodge still stands, its neon sign ready to flicker back to life the moment another traveler needs shelter from the storm. And inside, something that wears human faces waits patiently for the next person who will help it grow stronger, the next identity to add to its collection, the next soul to feed its endless hunger for what it means to be human. Sarah learned that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that don't want to destroy you, they want to become you. And in a world where people disappear every day, where travelers vanish on lonely roads without a trace, who's to say how many of those friendly faces we meet are really our own?